So think with me for a moment. Here you are. It's the last few days of your life. And you know it. You know your life is going to be over in, let's just say, 5 days. How would you look at that week? How would you look at the people that you love? What would the conversations be of the people with the people you care about? How would you perceive just everyday life? Would you take it for granted? Would you go to bed early and get up early? Would you change anything? What would your last words be? That's kind of where we are with Jesus here. Chapter 23 is Jesus' last public message before he's crucified. It's the last time he would step foot inside this temple and give a message. What do you think Jesus' message would be? What do you think he would say? Well, that's what we're going to look at, so you don't have to try to figure it out. He recorded it for us. But what we do know is he is going to address the religious leaders of his day. He's going to address a multitude. He was going to address his disciples. He was going to address you and I. Now, at the time, there was about 6,000 Pharisees that were in Jerusalem. And then there were many more followers that weren't card-carrying Pharisees. They were the wannabes. They were the prospectors, if you want to call it that. They were the ones that were hanging out with the Pharisees, hoping to maybe learn from them. Most of the Pharisees were probably middle-class businessmen. Most of them were probably sincere in their pursuits of truth and holiness. We know that among some of these Pharisees were some notable men. You had Nicodemus in John chapter 3. He was noteworthy. You have Joseph of Arimathea, John chapter 19. You have an unnamed Pharisee in Mark chapter 12. And then you have Gamaliel, who showed great love and support to the church, who taught Paul, Acts chapter 5. But then you had a group that somewhere along the way lost sight of what it was all about. Took their eyes off what they should have been on. Lost focus. And as a result, what did they do? They created this religious system that promoted themselves, that added to their material gain. They lost something. And Jesus is going to reveal to us, really, what this religious system that these religious leaders created was lacking. You see, there's false religious systems and there's false leaders that are out there that want you to follow them and want you to follow their systems, but they are lacking. There's something about them that there is no substance to. And it's this that Jesus addresses with his last word. Why? Because he knows that if he addresses this, people will know the truth. They will know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He would protect his disciples, saying, hey, don't follow in their footsteps, but live for something different. And what we're going to see today is this, that when God broke his silence, he reveals where the religious leaders were lacking. But it wasn't just for them back then. I also believe it's a warning for us today, because this will be the one thing that impacts our witness. And so the first thing that we're going to see in the first 3 verses is that these religious leaders and their religious system lacked integrity. And you're probably immediately thinking, yeah, I know somebody. Because we all know somebody, right? But notice what Jesus said. It says, then Jesus spoke to the multitude and his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. Interesting. Do as they say, not as they do. That's what Jesus tells them. But before we kind of look at that, before we look at why he said those things, we need to look at who he's speaking to, because it's very important. There's two groups of people here that Jesus is speaking to. We have the multitude and we have the disciples. That's who he's talking to here. Part of that multitude, I would imagine, are some of these religious leaders, some of these Pharisees and Sadducees, and the disciples were those who were following him. The multitude would be those, this is my thought on it anyway. The multitude are those that are wanting to know what's for lunch that day. Because Jesus sometimes just shows up and feeds people. Like, hey, what's for lunch today? Let's see what Jesus is going to do. It's like Jesus is this entertainer that they need to come and they need to find out what's on the menu, or what's the next show going to look like, or what's the next story he's going to tell. And we have those in our world today. We have the multitude, the people that are looking. You know what's interesting? Our front door is no longer the doors that you walk through. Our front doors are the internet. It's our website. They say that most people check you out 4 to 5 times before they'll even walk through the door. There's a multitude out there, and it's broadening, and people are looking. They're wanting to see something. They're wanting to understand who we are. But then we have the disciples. Who were the disciples? Well, what is a disciple? That's really the question we should ask ourselves, isn't it? A disciple is one that was longing to be with, longing to be like, and wanting to do what Jesus did. For these group, the 12 in particular, we know it was the group that he himself went and called and said, hey, I believe in you. You can do this. It was those that didn't make the cut with everybody else. But Jesus believed in them. And so we have the same two groups today. We have those that are the multitude, and we have those that are disciples. Which one are you? Which one are you? Or do you just want to know what's for lunch? Or do you really want to be like Jesus, be with Jesus, and do what Jesus did? Which one are you? So then Jesus goes on and he points out their inconsistencies. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees, you know what they do? They sit in Moses' seat, but they are inconsistent. So respect the position, but don't repeat their practice. That's what Jesus says. Respect their position. It's a position of authority. Respect their authority, but don't do what they do. Kind of weird, but that's what he tells them. He says, do what they say, not what they do. So what is it that they were doing or not doing that was so bad? That Jesus would say, don't do that. Well, it starts with where they sat. They sat in Moses' seat. Moses' seat. If Moses had a seat and your name isn't Moses, you probably shouldn't sit there. That's just what I'm thinking. Right? There's some positions that we should not assume upon ourselves. There's some positions where you can look and say, okay, that has Moses' name on it, and if I kind of take his seat, maybe I'm putting myself in a position I shouldn't be in. And that's kind of what these guys were doing. They were the self-appointed keepers of the law, and they were doing things that they should not be doing. But the other thing we know about Moses' seat is where it was. It was where people could see you. Like if you were sitting in Moses' seat, people knew it. They knew all about the Pharisees. They sat in this seat and they did what? Well, they interpreted the law. Now, we could look at that and say, that's not bad, is it? No, that's not bad at all. Somebody needed to. Think about it. They just started off doing the right thing because, they in that time, having a Bible was not something that everybody had. It wasn't like everybody had multiple copies like we have today. Sitting in your, how many Bibles do you have in your home? We have Bibles under seats that people don't even look at. We've got so many Bibles that's so readily available to us, but back then that wasn't the case. So what was needed was somebody to read the Bible to the people and then kind of explain it to them. And so they started off with good intentions, but something happened along the way where all of a sudden they forgot who they were and who they were talking about. And then it got to the place where Jesus himself has to say, well, you know what? Just do what they say, but don't do what they do. People were hoping for faithful teachers, hoping for faithful interpretation. So what was the problem? I'm going to tell you this. People are hoping the same thing today. People are hoping that people will interpret the scriptures to them well. They're hoping that the word of God is true and perfect. And here's what we see. The problem was not with the scriptures. No, the law of God, we're told, is perfect. The problem was the integrity of the people and the lifestyle of the people that were teaching those principles to the people did not match. What they said and what they did not go hand in hand. And we got to be careful of that. They taught expositionally. They sat in authority. But you know what? They were filled with hypocrisy. There's a great danger of knowing the truth, but not living it. I was reading about a Bible teacher in a private school the other day, and this guy gets up, and he wasn't thought of very highly. People didn't really like him, but he was their Bible teacher. And so he gets up in front of his class, and he says to the kids, he goes, all right, why do people call me a Christian? That was his question to him. One kid, this would have been me, pipes up and said, maybe it's because they don't know you. That would have been me. I would have totally answered that way. But before we turn on these guys and say, well, how could they do that? How could these religious leaders do this? Remember what Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10:12. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Before we start pointing the finger, let's ask ourselves, God, what can I learn from this? Let's turn this text inward and ask, am I practicing the things that I'm preaching? Does my life match up? You see, the first sign of bad or poor spiritual leadership is their lack of integrity. The Pharisees, or to the Pharisees, righteousness meant an outward conformity to the law, but yet they ignored the inward condition of their heart. The Pharisees were careful to say the right words and follow the right ceremonies, but they didn't inwardly obey the law. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 5, he says, but know this, in the last days, perilous times will come. Stop there. Let that sink in for a moment. Why? Because I think what we're going to hear next sounds a lot familiar of the days that we live in. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the form of godliness but denying its power. And such people turn away. You see, when we don't have integrity, what do? We have this form of godliness, but we deny the power of God. And you know what the power of God can do? The same thing it could do 2,000 years ago. Change the trajectory of one's life. It can rewrite the end of the story. The power of God is still alive and well today. But we need to ask ourselves, okay, God, am I trusting in that power for you to do in my life today what you want to do so that it's not written about me like it was written about them? We know that God desires an inward trust. That's why David wrote Psalm 51. You see, to preach one thing and practice another, it's hypocrisy. And there's no other way to label that. The sad thing is it leads to the next thing that we're going to see. And that is that in verse 4, that they lacked sympathy. When you have no integrity, you're not going to be sympathetic to the people around you. Right? Notice what he says, for they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. So Jesus points out that the leaders of that time, they lacked the sympathy by placing burdens on people that they themselves were not willing to lift. So if anybody in leadership at this church ever tells you to do something, but you don't see them doing it first, leave. Or at least tell me, and I'll take them behind the woodshed. Right? We can't do that. If you're a leader in any part of leadership in the church and you're not serving the people, there's a problem. I'm just telling you that now. Here's what I look for when I'm looking for people to lead ministries or be a part of stuff at the church. When do they go to the buffet line? That's what I look for. Are they the first one there? Enjoy it. You know, I look for those who are in the back, fighting over who's going to be last rather than who's going to be first. It's said that leaders go first, but eat last. These guys, they lacked sympathy, and it led to their indifference with the people. Like, you do this. You see, religion is putting your trust in a practice rather than a person. It's like trying to hug a shadow. You ever tried that? You can't. It's cotton candy. I love giving cotton candy to kids for the first time. Their parents hate me, but I love it. Because you give it to them, and their eyes get this big because it's this big old fluffy thing, and then they put it in their mouth, and they look at you all disappointed. Like, what happened? Like, exactly. Religion is just like cotton candy. It's big and fluffy and looks so good, but the minute you put it in, it's gone. It's like hugging a shadow. It doesn't work. The sins of the Pharisees was hypocrisy with the foundation on pride. Their religion was external, not internal. It was to impress people, not please God. At the end of the day, what's our goal? That we add to the fame of Jesus, that Jesus is pleased. Not that you like me. I don't even like me half the time. But at the end of the day, my goal is that Jesus is exalted. You see, the Pharisees were harder on others than they were themselves. The Pharisees commanded, but they did not participate. They were hypocrites, hypocritical religious dictators, not spiritual leaders. That's who they were. And what you need to know is it's easy to fall into that trap. It's easy to think that I'm doing the right thing or I'm saying the right things when we're not. And here's what I believe. I believe that the first step towards that downward spiral is when we care more about spiritual gifts than the gifts of the Spirit, than the fruit of the Spirit. When I care more about the things that I can do so that people will think that I'm something rather than what the fruit of the Spirit wants to produce in my life, which is love. The sad thing is when this happens, we love less and lack sympathy, just like the religious leaders, which then reveals the root of the problem. Have you noticed this downward spiral? The root of the problem was this: they lacked humility. They lacked humility. It says, but all their works they did. some of the stuff that's in here, I'm sorry, I just had to laugh at, and I'm not going to say the names right, but that's okay. You'll get the understanding of it. But it says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garment. They love the best seats in the best place at. They love the best places at feasts and the best seats in the synagogue, greetings in the marketplace, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi. That's how I hear it. Rabbi. I can roll my R's. So their lack of humility was revealed in their desire to be seen by men, an overemphasis on things, loving the best places and seats, and to hear their titles called. They wanted to be called by their title. Now, some of you really feel like you need to call me pastor, and that's okay. But if I look at you like, who are you talking to? Don't get offended. Like, my parents settled on Shawn. There was nothing significant about the name. I don't need a title. Right? And these guys wanted to hear their title. Now, where did they go wrong? Well, they went wrong because they cared more about the praise of men than the glory of God. We all know those people, don't we? Those people that care more about how people see them, care more about themselves. They're probably the most humble people that they know. You know, they've got it all together. But then Jesus brings up this phylacteries and enlarged borders on their garments. What is that? Well, that was the way that they could assure that people would notice them. Okay? A phylacteries it consisted of strips of paper with Exodus 13, 1 through 16, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and Deuteronomy 11, 18 through 21. And what it was, there was two of them. There was one square box, smaller than this, that they had, and it had a strap on it, and they would shove those scriptures in it, and what they would do is they would wear it on their forehead. I thought about I was going to make one, and then I thought I could grab an Operation Christmas trial box. I probably shouldn't do that. But so here you have it. Could you imagine if I walked in like this? What are you going to do? You're going to notice me, right? Especially if the ones that they would normally wear were smaller ones like this, but all of a sudden I had this one because this one wasn't big enough, and I wanted you to, and so they had these, but then they had one that they had also on their left arm. So they had one like this and one like this. Okay? Does anybody else think I look stupid? I feel stupid. But that's what they do. Now, if that wasn't enough, they were only supposed to wear those certain times, but they were wearing them all the time. And then what they would do is to assure that you knew how big of a burden it was to have that thing on their forehead, they would begin to rock. Right? So as they were preaching and doing, they're rocking, and you're looking at that thing thinking, what's in there? Oh, no, oh. A bit ridiculous. Then you had their garments, which had tassels on it. Well, they enlarged those. They wanted people to see them. That was the whole idea, was that people would look at them. Well, we don't have boxes on our foreheads today. But how many of us have those big Bibles in our living room? For everybody to see, but nobody opens. I've got one, I think. We had one at one time. I remember as a kid going to youth group, and you always had that one kid. That was before your Bible was on your phone. Remember those days? It was a long time ago. It's like so last millennial. And there was always that one kid that carried the big Bible. And you knew who he was, and you're like, you didn't want to hang out with that kid. Like, there was the big Bible kid That wasn't me. But anyway, that's kind of what I see here. It's like it's a big Bible committee just on their forehead. Everybody to look at, but nobody open. But the next thing we see is not only did they look stupid, but they sat in places that they should have never sat. It says that they took these seats where everybody could see them. These seats were prepared for the elders of the synagogue and those that were the doctors of the law. And they were in the front of the Ark of the Covenant, and those who sat on them would sit down, and when people walked in, they would be facing them. And, there they were. Everybody could see them when they came in. They were seats of great honor that they've saved for themselves. They were ambitious. They wanted everybody to look at them. And they wanted everybody to call them by their title, rabbi, which means master or teacher. It was a revered position. They wanted people to think highly of themselves. To them, success meant being recognized and being praised by men. That's how they knew they were successful. They took these positions of greatness. They sought the best seats, not just in the synagogue, but also at public dinners. What I'm finding is that where a man sits really bears no relationship to who a man is. There's many a man or woman that's sitting in a highly esteemed seat, but is anything than a highly esteemed person. So be careful. Albert Einstein wrote this: try not to become a man of success, but rather try to become a man of value. Thought that was interesting. Their lack of humility blinded them to the truth. But you know what else it did? It hindered people's view of the altar. When they were sitting in front of the altar, what were people looking at? Them. Couldn't see the altar. Couldn't see the mercy seat. Couldn't see the cherubim. Couldn't see what they needed to see. Well, obviously they couldn't see those things because they couldn't go into the Holy of Holies, but the altar that, they couldn't see what was beyond that. They lacked humility, blinded people of the truth. So much so that when Jesus, who was the way, the truth, and the life, was standing in their midst, they couldn't recognize him. But what I love about it is Jesus doesn't leave us discouraged. He gives us the solution to the problem. And that's what we're going to see in verses 8 through 12. It says, "But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teacher, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." So the last things that Jesus is saying, we're going to look at some more next week as we look at the 7 woes that he gives. Interesting thing, just so that you can do some research before. Look at how they correlate with the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. Just fascinating. But Jesus tells his listeners here, don't be called rabbi, father, or master. And the idea behind it is this. He's saying, don't think too highly of yourself. That's why I love kids. Kids just say the darndest things. You know how many kids have asked me if I'm pregnant? You know how humbling it is to say, yeah, for 50 years? Can't make this stuff up. This is one of the reasons I love working at Christian Brain, the Camp for the Handicapped. Those handicapped people say the darndest things. I mean, I still have the stuffed animal hippo in my truck from when the girl called me a hippo last summer and told me I shouldn't eat as I'm eating a salad. You know, I mean, there's just something about it. We should not think too highly of ourselves. Now, was it wrong for a rabbi or for a teacher to be called rabbi or for us to call our biological dad father? No, it's not wrong. It only becomes wrong when you associate it with our spiritual leaders. Give them a position that they were never told to have. Well, but Shawn, don't you know Paul said he was somebody's spiritual father? Yeah, that's what 1 Corinthians 4:15 says. But you know what Paul never did? Paul never told that guy to call him father. He said, I was just like his dad. And we've been there. We've done that. I mean, we've had people in our lives that have acted like people that were lacking. I know that's my story. But you know, never did any of those guys ask me to call him dad. He didn't ask them to call him dad or father. You know, he didn't ask him to call him rabbi. He referred to himself as Paul, a servant, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. You see, God places spiritual leaders in the church, but the spiritual leaders in the church should never replace God in our lives or in the church. And the problem happens when we make them what they were never supposed to be. I was at a conference one time, and one of the larger churches in the Calvary Chapel movement, the pastor just had fallen morally, and another pastor was trying to restore him, and this pastor had permission from the other pastor to share at the pastor's conference about the situation. And so as he's getting up and he's sharing it, I will never forget what he said. He said, he asked him what happened, and the guy said, well, I just began to believe, you know, what people were telling me. I just let the fame get to me. That was his comment, or his response. And the other pastor looked at him and said, well, whoever told you you're famous? But yet, how often do we think, oh, you know, things are going well, I must be doing something right. When in reality, what we should be saying is, things are going well, look what God is doing right. Because if I can explain it, and if it's got my fingerprints on it, you don't want to have anything to do with it. We want stuff that we can explain, that at the end of it all, people are like, hey, look what Jesus did up there. I've been there. I've seen that group of people, and you can't make any sense of it. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. You see, a true leader leads people into freedom and a closer relationship with Jesus, not into bondage and his ideas or beliefs. A true leader is going to set us free, point us to Jesus who can set us free. A true leader is humble. And then Jesus goes on to say that true spiritual leaders do two things. They avoid elevated titles and they accept lowly tasks. True leaders are humble. That's who they are. You see, we live in a time where bigger is perceived as better and humility is often forgotten. People believe the press. People believe what's being written about them. D.L. Moody put it this way. He said, a good many are kept out of the service of Christ, deprived of the luxury of working for God because they are they're trying to do great things. Let us be willing to do little things, and let us remember that nothing is small in which God is the source. Paul puts it this way in Ephesians 4, 1 through 3. I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Paul says, walk worthy of our calling. So what do healthy, good leaders look like? I believe they look like what Micah 6:8 says. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. What is God looking for? What does God require? Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. And so I'm going to give you guys an invitation to join me as we add to the fame of Jesus, as we humbly love and serve our community with a love that's outside of ourselves, a love that is still redeeming and working and rewriting the ends of stories. So may it be said of us that we do justly, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly with our God.